afternoon and good morning. Welcome to this event, which is organized by the United Nations Environment Programme and the UNEP DTU Partnership. My name is Elisabeth Resch, and I welcome you today from the UN city in Copenhagen. I welcome you to this 2-hour virtual event, which is part of an event series that we're organizing to present common challenges faced by Asian countries when implementing their nationally determined contributions, or NDCs. This event series is held under the project NDC Action. Co-led by UNEP and the UNEP DTU Partnership, our project seeks to support countries in facilitating the implementation of climate resilient and low carbon pathways, all in alignment with the national and global goals. Before I lay out the topics and the agenda, let me assure you, our audience at first, that we will follow European laws regarding privacy and saving your data. We comply with the General Data Protection Act, also known as GDPR. This means that your personal data is safely processed and stored, and all of your rights pursuant to the GDPR are respected. You have full access to the data being processed about you, and at any time you can request that inaccurate data be rectified or deleted. If you have further questions on this, please contact my colleague Iris, whose contact details you will find in the chat. Today's webinar is very timely, as Asian countries are seeking to forge strategies to finance the NDCs. It is widely agreed that implementing the NDCs will require resources that are sizable. The Asian Development Bank estimates that Asia alone must invest in the near future every year between 140 and 170 billion for mitigation actions. On top of this, there is a further 40 billion US dollars to be invested annually into adaptation action. This will have to occur every year between 2013 and 2030 in order to place the region on a sustainable pathway. It is also evident that these resources exceed the volumes of international aid and that a wide variety of sources, national and international, subnational, and public and private, will have to be tapped. What is problematic is that current regional analysis suggests that planning for NDC implementation, in particular their financing, is still in its infant shoes. Many countries are at the early stages of planning. It requires countries to mainstream their NDC actions into planning and budgeting processes, including into sectoral budgeting and planning processes. Governments in the region will also have to create an enabling environment. In this regard, what is also underexplored is how domestic resources, such as domestic fiscal policies, can contribute to climate action. There are many options, and there are many examples globally of this. There are revenues from taxes that can disincentivize emission-intensive activities while raising revenue for climate action. There are domestic savings, sovereign wealth funds, pension funds to be tapped. There is a big opportunity in greening banking and insurance assets. And of course, and today we will learn more about this, there is a large opportunity in restructuring and reforming subsidies and reducing harmful subsidies. What we want to do with this webinar today is stimulate thinking and stimulate a debate to ensure that in the near future, more and more of these options are considered in Asian countries. In this endeavor, we draw on the experience of countries and practitioners that have done it. With them, we will discuss today how to mobilize domestic resources for climate action. Let me briefly walk you what awaits you in today's agenda. We will start with a country situation analysis by 2 countries which have a lot of insights to share, Vietnam and Bangladesh. I welcome the 2 speakers that will share the experience of their ministries. This will be followed by a deep dive into fiscal instruments used for climate action in Asian countries. Potdevin from UNEP will explain what examples there are and what opportunities are still untapped. She will also explain how we can ensure that existing fiscal measures are more climate friendly. Her presentation will be followed by presentations from 2 esteemed speakers from the IMF and UNDP. Who will explain how to mainstream climate change into national budgets and planning processes, what procedures there are, and how different countries have taken different approaches. Our final expert joins us from the European Commission. Elva Bova will share evidence of green budgeting practices in the European Union, specifically in European Union countries, and show what different accountability mechanisms and governance mechanisms there are. There will be an opportunity for you to ask questions in the end. We ask that you pose your questions in the chat throughout the presentation, and we will address them in the end in the form of a Q&A session. I look forward to an interesting discussion. Without further ado, let me introduce the first speaker, Dr. Trinh from the Ministry of Planning and Investment in Vietnam. Dr. Trinh has a PhD in green growth implementation at the provincial level. She contributed to the formulation and implementation of the Vietnam Green Growth Strategy and Action Plan, and the planning process where environmental and climate change issues were considered for sustainable socioeconomic development strategies. She is active in UNFCCC negotiations focusing on climate finance issues and working with development partners across the globe. She is also a co-chair of the Financial Working Group at the Global Partnership Forum and assistant to co-chair of the Asian LEDS Forum Steering Committee. Dr. Trinh, welcome. The floor is all yours.
For your kind introduction. I would like to take this opportunity to thank the organizers and UNDP for inviting Vietnam to share our experience in this very important for financing the implementing of NDC in Vietnam, so that we can have more opportunity to exchange with international organizations and also with the country, so that we can have more opportunities to mobilize resources to finance climate action. And actually, my presentation will give you an overview of the landscape of Vietnam planning and budgeting process, and also describe what are going on nearly through the climate expenditure and investment review in Vietnam, which we have done with the UNDP for 29 provinces, over 63 provinces in Vietnam, more than a half. And we also review the expenditure managed by ministries in Vietnam for the climate action. And from that, we will share with you the needs and challenges in mobilizing climate finance resources in Vietnam, so that we will hope to share our experiences as well as expect to get opportunities to working further with international organizations and also other countries for achieving the climate targets. As you can see, involving in our climate landscape, we have the all important ministry, including Ministry of Planning and Investment and also Ministry of Finance. We use the bottom-up and top-down approach through the planning system. We call the socio-economic development plans, including all activities, and we have special national target program focusing on climate change and green growth. That means that we both focus on adaptation and mitigation. We also create the forum we call the supporting for climate change response program, which we attract the interest and support from donors community like World Bank, like JICA, and also AFD. Then we will pull in a lot of support, and the disbursement will based on policy metrics where provinces and also ministries commit to reform the policies to make more climate resilient, and also we'll have concrete output. Based on that, the donors community will provide financial support for us. And actually, after COP26, we are reviewing the targeted program for green growth and climate change, and now we are designing together with the donor community for the NDC support program. And we are now also working very hard with designing what we call the climate finance strategy. But how it will look like will depend much on the review and also experiences learned from like South Africa or like Indonesia. So where blended sources will be reviewed, and also the mechanisms for financing on the climate targets. So we think that from this event we can learn a lot, and also we can. But for after COP26, it seems that for all the case very well known like South Africa or Philippines, it most focusing on the mitigation aspect, but from the developing country and also vulnerable countries like Vietnam or Bangladesh, we are also looking forward to the mechanism for adaptation because we are hit very hardly by the climate change. And as talk, we would like to share with you the total expenditure in Vietnam from 2012 to 2020. You can see the level of public expenditure on climate change in Vietnam is equivalent to nearly 11% of the total state budget expenditure, and 3% of the country's GDP in 2018. This result is somehow higher than that of some other countries in the region, such as Thailand, at around 0.53% of the GDP, and Cambodia at 1.64%, according to UNDP recent climate change review. And the total public climate finance in Vietnam is around 166 trillion Vietnam dong, and it means that the public expenditure on mitigation activities is nearly half of that, and spending on adaptation is around 111 trillion Vietnam dong. So you can see the pie, the percentage of the allocation between adaptation and mitigation. And we also recognize the importance of the private investment for climate change. Actually, from 2010 to 2014, we also have the climate expenditure review, but not yet have the capacity in terms of financial and human resource, and also methodology for collecting the data on the private investment for climate change. But at that time, we have the overall landscape for 67% of the gap for the needs between the for the needs of the climate finance is 70% we expect from the private sector. And for the 2012 to 2020, as you can see on the screen, we have mobilized the private investment for climate change and green growth is already increased at around 27 billion US dollars per year during the 2016 to 2020, and the largest contribution to this investment is from the green credit channel. We also have the green bonds. Vietnam has also issued around 564 million US dollars on green bonds, and the economy show great potential for development of issuing the green bonds. And among these among these 5 and 64 million green US dollars for green bond, the mitigation finance is around 415 million, and adaptation finance is just only 148 million. So you can see the for the public expenditure, mostly is focusing on adaptation, but for the private investment, mostly is focusing on mitigation. So we hope that in the coming time, we can have some more effective coordination, or to see what is the effectiveness for that. Now we just have the raw material on that, but we don't know what the effectiveness of that. So we hope that we can hear more experiences or advices from the international organization on how or what is the best for Vietnam to have the best financial structure in extracting financial resources for climate change and green growth action plan. And here on the screen, you can see the provincial budgeting for allocation for climate change, and you can see that at the provincial level, at the grassroots level, they are the one who facing daily to the climate change impacts. So adaptation was also the dominant expenditure, representing over 90% of the climate budget in all the year, and adaptation is a high priority for Vietnam's public expenditure also. And for the mixed adaptation and mitigation investment makes up around less than 10%. And you can see that the investment of adaptation and mitigation has remained relatively stable, with over 90% allocated purely for adaptation projects during 2016 to 2020, and from 6 to 10% was allocated for mixed adaptation, as already described. And at the ministry level, actually you may already know or not, but in our system we have the local budget, and we also have the central budget to implement the activities at the local level, because we have the delegate the power between the central level and also the provincial level. But at the central level, we also have national programs and also have activities at the grassroots level. So this expenditure is also very important, because it will cover trans-regional or inter-regional climate activities. So you can see on the screen that we have during the 2016 to 2020, the climate budget very quite stable, and between 26 and 38 is come from the contribute over 70% of the climate change budget is also come from the ODA sources, and some of the loans from ODA also go to the provinces for the repayment. So we have the merge and also support from the central level down to the local level. And most of the expenditure is also targeted at adaptation, and has been over 70% of the climate change budget during the period of 2016 to 2020. And over the climate budget was composed of 70% adaptation, and the remainder is for mitigation and also for blended or cross-cutting between the adaptation and mitigation. Having said that, we still see a lot of challenges in mobilizing climate finance resources in Vietnam. We see that adaptation is still a very high demand in Vietnam, and it also lack of the tools or technical tools for us to quantify the additional budget for climate change impact or added value for the project, because everything now have the cost norms for construction. But with the hit by climate change or increased impact from climate change, that it require added value or added cost to that. So before we think of mobilizing resources, we have to think of how to estimate what we need. So for adaptation works construction, we think that we should have agreed or more capable human resources to calculate the added value. And also the impacts from climate change on environment and economy, society are still increasing, and we need more investment, especially after the COP26, where the government have the commit for a very high net zero with closer time target. So we need more efforts and also need more finance for mitigation action to achieve that high target. But also we have to keep or more than more money or more finance resources for adaptation needs on the field, and also with the expected more frequent and more hard climate events, then of course we need support from international communities with the clear guidance on the procedures, and also need more like disbursement requirements or more transparent on that. So and also for the human resources, we need both at the central level and also at the local level for not only preparing or describing our needs in the feasible projects, but also we need the capable to understand the procedures by international organizations, so we can absorb and also disburse according to criteria and use effectively the resources that we are provided. And also we also think of the improvement in climate change policies to adapt to a new to the new COP with attracting more private investment, and also call for their social responsibilities to the government agendas, not only for their interests but also to join hand with the government for not only mitigation action but also for the adaptation. So thank you very much for your attention, and looking forward to further collaboration with all of you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Trinh. I was very impressed by your presentation, and particularly I saw that you have such a high share of public spending in the provincial budgets on adaptation, which truly is very important in a vulnerable country like Vietnam. I know that you cannot join us for the last Q&A session, so I just want to thank you here for your presentation and for sharing your insights with us, and move on to the next presentation, where our speaker joins us from Bangladesh. I would like to welcome Mr. Mahedi Masuduzzaman. He's a Deputy Secretary of Finance at the Bangladeshi Ministry of Finance. He has economic policy and public finance experience spanning 19 years, and his current responsibilities include the fiscal management, policy formulation for fiscal and macroeconomic management, macroeconomic and development policy analysis, budget planning, national budget preparation, budget implementation, monitoring, and evaluation processes. Before his current role, Mr. Masuduzzaman worked for 3 years as fiscal policy expert of the Inclusive Budgeting and Financing for Climate Resilience project at the United Nations Development Program. He played an important role in developing the publication Climate Public Finance Tracking in Bangladesh approach and methodology. He also played a key role in preparing the Bangladesh Climate Fiscal Framework of 2020. This experience, along with his scholarly interests and work, make him a particularly knowledgeable source on this matter. Mr. Masuduzzaman, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for introducing me, and thank you very much for the organizer to invite me in this August. The presentation outline is like this. We will talk about why Bangladesh is climate vulnerability, Bangladesh INDC and updated NDC. We'll talk about cost of implementing activities in NDC, climate fund flow of Bangladesh, climate dimension in ministry budget framework, access to climate finance by Bangladesh, and finally we will talk about challenge. So first of all, Bangladesh is innocent victims of adverse impact of the climate change. We all know, and the Global Climate Change Risk Index 2021 recently released by German ranked Bangladesh as 7th among the countries most affected by extreme weather events in last 20 years from 1999. Now, the question is why Bangladesh is so vulnerable? There are some reasons. The first reason is Bangladesh is a low-lying delta, heavy monsoon rainfall, and many mega cyclone occurs in the regular interval, huge coastal area, our coastal area is huge, drought, and finally poverty and high population density may cause climate vulnerability to Bangladesh. Bangladesh Indian National Determined Contribution was submitted on 25th September 2015 to UNFCCC, and Bangladesh considered the baseline year was 2011, and Bangladesh covered only power sector, industry sector, and transport sector. Subsequently, Bangladesh prepared the NDC implementation roadmap and action plan in 2018. You might be knowing that Bangladesh NDC contains both mitigation and adaptation measures. But recently, Bangladesh updated this NDC and it's submitted to the UNFCCC. So, what is next? Next, Bangladesh contributes only 0.35% of global emission. And now, question is why Bangladesh is reducing greenhouse gas? Because and Bangladesh updating the NDC, because the NDC update aims to further mitigation action that Bangladesh may take to tackle its growing emissions and play its role with the global efforts. The current NDC covers both energy, industrial process and product use, agriculture, forestry, and other land use sector and waste sector as well. And the latest one is considered as a 2012 base year. In NDC, Bangladesh will reduce its greenhouse gas by 6.70% unconditionally. And this expenditure will be covered from Bangladesh own resources. But if Bangladesh receives fund from the international organization or other countries, then Bangladesh will reduce its emission by 15.12% below the business as usual by 2030. And Bangladesh like to reduce all total is 21.25 below business as usual by 2030. By this time, Bangladesh have been accomplishment major things by grid-connected renewable energy-based power plant, efficiency improvement in power generation, etc. Bangladesh also introducing Meta Build program focus on steel and electrical manufacturing industries, result reduction of 5.0 metric tons of emission per year. I'm skipping this because the main area is about NDC. And Bangladesh also target to reduce greenhouse gas by 21 to 30, and there is a roadmap. You can see the roadmap here, clear roadmap. Both sector, energy sector, then industry sector. Industry sector is a very good initiative from Bangladesh that will include increased energy efficiency and conservation principle implementation in wider number of industries, replacing inefficient boiler with improved boilers, implement rooftop solar panel and wind energy in factories, switching from wet to dry process and horizontal to vertical rolling of grinding the cement factories. So this will be start soon. There are other mitigation strategy that will cover in the future. Bangladesh also reduce mitigation from the agriculture sector. You can see the total. And let me talk about our estimated cost of implementing activities identified in the updated NDC. You can see here, we need, Bangladesh will spend 32 billion US dollar from 2021 to 2030 is unconditional. Bangladesh will spend this one, but if Bangladesh get more fund from the international organization like GCF, then we like to spend more. It's 143 billion. Now, what is our fund flows process in Bangladesh? You can see from the slide that Bangladesh main source is domestic resource. Then we have also foreign resource, but the foreign resource is only 5% of total expenditure that we are expending in climate region. Our main source is government operating budget, then government development budget. Because we have private sector financing, but we don't include in this as a private sector financing, but it's insignificant. It's very insignificant of amount. And alternatives follow is, we know, you might be knowing that Bangladesh is established a fund called Bangladesh Climate Change Trust Fund. This fund is working since 2010, and this resource is coming all from our own budget, not from the foreign resource. So this is the overall fund management in Bangladesh for climate change. Then next, the Bangladesh climate budget. What is our recent activities about the budget allocation? This is the current fiscal year, 2021 and 2022. The cumulative budget allocation of the most relevant 25 ministries division accounts for around 57% of our national budget, our central budget. 57% of our national budget. And out of this, total 7.26% is climate relevant. 7.26% is climate relevant, which is 1% of our GDP. The budget allocation is increasing over time. You can see in fiscal year 2015 and 16, the budget was around $1.4 billion, but recently it's increased almost twofold. It's 2.96 billion US dollars. So you can see the government commitment in this budget allocation. Now that I mentioned earlier, Bangladesh Climate Change Trust Fund undertaken 800 projects, which and is covered almost 450 million US dollars. And this budget is mainly spent on adaptation, mitigation, and climate change research. from this fund. So far, we have received from external source, from foreign source is only 200 billion US dollar, and loan 250. And on the other hand, the co-finance is 747 million US dollar. So we only received 200 million dollar, and from green climate funds we received five projects and only 100 million US dollars. This is the NDC allocation for NDC mitigation and adaptation. You can see the current fiscal year, Bangladesh allocate around 22,000 Bangladeshi taka for the adaptation related, and Bangladesh allocated for mitigation purposes 2,269 million taka. It's taka. Climate finance is major intervention in Bangladesh. Climate dimension embedded in Bangladesh budget circular and ministry budget framework. Budget circular issued from Ministry of Finance for the next financial year in November, which provide strategic direction to the ministries for preparation of MTBF. MTBF is a medium-term budget framework. Budget framework has been turned climate inclusive, linking the major climate policies and strategies. This includes BCC, SCP, and NDC. BCC means Bangladesh Climate Change Strategies and Action Plan. And the budget cycle also provides operational guide regarding these climate issues. Ministry of Finance provide indicative budget links to the administrative ministry for making their own budget under MTBF process. And Ministry of Finance provides budget ceiling for the land reserve, for example, Ministry of Water Resources. And then Ministry of Water Resources is the authority to take the project and program, whether it will be climate mitigation or climate adaptation or other thing. And Bangladesh developed a separate climate finance module in our IBAS. IBAS means our IPMIS, you all know, and this module is completely integrated with IBAS++. And we have adopted a climate fiscal framework in 2014, updated in 2020 to make public financial management system climate inclusive or given for source of domestic finance. First of all is private sector engagement. Private sector engagement, Bangladesh is likely to include in future private sector funding in this regard. Then business sector also will be included. Bangladesh are trying to increase tax collection, and that will be financed for in this climate sense. Bangladesh will engage NGO and civil society organization in this regard, and Bangladesh will like to issue climate. It is not is functioning, but it is our future plan. Then our Honorable Prime Minister recently said that gradually cut subsidies in power, gas, and fuel sectors that can be spent in the other private areas, like climate sense. So, what is our challenge? Financial resource from national budget will be the main source of NDC in Bangladesh. Difficult to manage all the source from national in our own source, but we need international support in this regard, especially for mitigation. Then private sector, business sector investment is very low in current, so it's a problem. Formulation of fully costed climate investment plan is underway. Capacity of local government institutions incorporate and tracking climate dimension in their budgeting and planning process is underway. So, thank you very much. Thank you very much for your patient hearing.
Thank you very much, Mr. Masuduzzaman. A lot of interesting work in Bangladesh that I will come back to with some questions in the end to you. And your intro on subsidies also leads me to the next speaker. She will address that. Mrs. Claire Potdevin is a fiscal expert at UNEP. She is an economist specialized in public financial management and fiscal policies. She spent the last 5 years in Timor-Leste at the Ministry of Finance, UNDP, and the Asian Development Bank. And prior to that, she worked in Geneva at the ILO on decent work and global supply chains. Claire, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here. So in this presentation, I'll aim to explain why green fiscal policies are such a critical part in the effort to accelerate the achievement of NDCs, while also providing you with some relevant regional examples. So first, a bit of background and a few key points to have in mind to understand what makes fiscal reform so relevant. So I think I won't take anyone by surprise if I say that there's a large financing gap to address if we want to achieve the NDCs at the global level. I just wanted to include a couple of figures that UNEP recently published, which I believe are quite telling. First, based on a recent UNEP report, the State of Finance for Nature, for the world to meet the targets related to climate change, biodiversity, and land degradation, we will need global investments of up to 8.1 trillion by 2050. And we are far from that. So the current investment in nature-based solutions are estimated at around 133 billion per year, so far from the 536 billion that we will need annually. So obviously governments cannot solve this alone. Businesses, society will have to work together, but it just means that public resources need to be leveraged at an optimal level, and incentives can be used to accelerate the private investment. And still on the side of public financing, UNEP collaborated with the University of Oxford to establish a global recovery observatory, which tracks the shares of recovery spending that were directed towards green initiatives. And the latest data on that shows that around 30% of recovery spending goes towards initiative. And so we've seen this figure increase since the beginning of the pandemic, and well, it started very low. And while that's progress, it does remain insufficient, and we really need to think more about how expenditure can be used to achieve NDCs. So in addition, sorry, I just realized that might be in your way. Yes. In addition to the financing gap, another important challenge to account for is, well, the fact that very often resources that we use are actually underpriced. Why? That's because the social cost, the environmental cost, the health cost of using the resources are usually excluded from the price of producing and consuming these resources. And while those hidden costs are actually huge, for example, we estimate that environmental degradation usually costs around 2 to 8% of GDP in many developing countries. Similarly, the figures from the global food system are also quite telling. Those costs are estimated to be about $12 trillion per year. And finally, a third background point I want to make is the following. We know that through fiscal policy, states can affect the price of some goods and services, and as such, incentivize or discourage some specific behaviors. But we see that often the fiscal framework that are in place currently will have actually, in effect, a very harmful impact. So what do I mean by harmful? It's the fact that the support of government to sectors like agriculture or energy has played a role in the end reinforcing some unsustainable practices. For example, in most countries, the production and the use of fossil fuels is encouraged by large public subsidies. Again, a very telling number is an assessment by the IMF of fossil fuel subsidies, which were estimated to 5.9 trillion in 2020. So that's about 6.8% of GDP. And that's expected to actually increase in the coming years. If we look also at agricultural subsidies, a recent UNEP report that was prepared in collaboration with FAO and UNDP, you can see a picture here on the left of the slide. These reports analyze that 87% of subsidies to producers are either price distorting or harmful to nature and health. So the question is, how can green fiscal policies respond to that? Just a quick reminder of what fiscal policy is, just a very simple definition by the IMF, simply the use of spending and taxation to influence the economy. So here's what we can do with those. First, fiscal policies will help raise domestic revenues, which can then be used for climate finance, green investment. They can also enable a reduction in other taxes, taxes from other revenue sources, which might be distortive, such as taxes on labor, for example. Fiscal policies are also here to improve the alignment of government expenditure with environmental goals, such as NDCs. I think we'll hear more about this later when talking about budgeting, especially. We mentioned the existence of hidden costs and enterprise resources. So by reflecting externalities in prices, green fiscal policies can help to shift consumer and business behavior and to shift investment towards more sustainable patterns. That's something that can be done, for example, through environmental taxes, typically like a carbon tax. And one last aspect of green fiscal policy that I want to raise is that they should look at, they can look at long-term benefits in terms of people's well-being, environmental protection, resilience to climate, etc. So we see that there is a growing recognition of the role of green fiscal policies in supporting climate action. There are now 27 countries who implement a carbon tax globally, from 15 countries 10 years ago. We also see a growing interest for carbon pricing in the Asia-Pacific region, even though countries are still at very different stages of consideration and implementation. We also see signs of momentum towards the reform of fossil fuel subsidies at the global level. So to illustrate this, fossil fuel subsidies reform were included in 14 nationally determined contributions, and that was in 2019, so it may actually be revised up a little bit. So with this in mind, let's look at what instruments are used in practice. So financing large adaptation and mitigation investment in an already tight fiscal space is challenging, to say the least. And in that sense, ensuring that ensuring the most efficient use of limited resources is absolutely key, as well as aligning these resources with our targets. So that brings us to the importance of monitoring spending and assessing the results of the spending. Policymakers need to be able to understand to what extent national budgets are already funding or underfunding, for that matters, or our climate change goals. Because in many instances, if we look closely, well, it might actually not be the case. And for this, we see a growing role of green budgeting through the use of tagging and green taxonomies, which classifies spending by categories, and that facilitates the measure of green versus non-green allocation. A lot of countries in Asia were actually early adopters of this practice. We can cite the case of the Philippines, which I'll detail more in a second. Also Indonesia, Cambodia, or Nepal. Beyond the allocation, it's also key for policymakers to be able to understand the impacts of their budget spending, and this requires another important effort of result tracking. I provided here a few examples of available tools for assessing the quality of spending. Now, I think the next presentations would actually detail a bit more the aspects of budgeting, so I'll pass quickly and just look a bit more in detail at the case of the Philippines and at the government's work to develop a climate responsive budget through the use of climate change expenditure tagging. This is a work that was initiated in 2013. It has really showed benefits. It has made monitoring of climate change related expenses a lot easier. It has improved transparency by making all climate related information available in a single platform. And it just facilitates the alignment of budget allocation to the national planning documents. On this graph, you can see the increase in allocation of budget to the different identified pillars. So now that we talked about expenditure, let's talk a little bit about revenues, the other side of fiscal policies. And especially at the case, I'll start with the case of removing negative subsidies that I was mentioning earlier. So subsidies like fossil fuel subsidies or subsidies to agriculture are usually advocated as a tool to address poverty. Even though in practice they do tend to benefit wealthier groups who consume more. And removing those subsidies can not only reduce pollution and improve health by shifting behaviors, but they can also free up enormous amount of public resources, which can then be redirected to other priorities. We'll see an example of that in a minute. And I think it's important to note here that as energy prices go up, and it is likely that they will go up, it will become fiscally impossible for countries to sustain them. And countries who prepare for this now will have a very clear competitive advantage in the future. Here I want to bring the example of Indonesia, which is quite an interesting one. In 2013, the government of Indonesia announced the complete removal of all fossil fuel subsidies, and to limit the impact that this would have on vulnerable households related to a very clear increase in the price of gasoline and diesel, the government launched in parallel a social assistance scheme, the Productive Family Program, which assisted families with young children or families in need of health assistance. And in parallel, we also saw an increase in Indonesia's allocation to social protection, to infrastructure, as well to transfers to regions and villages for local development. So we really saw a shift from allocations to fossil fuel subsidies towards other sectors. Another aspect I'd like to go back is how great fiscal policies can also raise new and substantial public revenues. The figure here shows the evolution of revenues raised from carbon pricing instruments. So that includes carbon taxes and also ETS, emission trading system. And in 2020, a total of 64 carbon pricing instruments were in operation around the world, and that generated 56.8 billion in revenue, with a bit more than half of it from carbon taxes. And there's a lot of potential for this kind of future instruments. For example, the IMF estimated that a tax instrument on international air travel and shipping could raise up to 25 billion annually, which is enormous. So what happens with all the revenues? They're usually reintegrated to the general budget, although some countries also earmark them for specific climate priorities to support green investments in sustainable energy, in clean technologies. And of course, we just mentioned the case of recycling revenues for affected groups. So a good example of the swapping these investments between carbon-heavy industry and shifting them towards investment in green economy is India, which has linked the revenue from a coal tax to a dedicated green fund. And also in the last few years, we saw a shift in public finance flows from petroleum products. So there was a significant reduction between 2014 and 2017 in the support to petroleum products, and in parallel, there was a sharp increase in support to green energies. Although fossil fuel subsidies still represent a larger share, but this is a movement in the right direction. Two other examples I want to bring up here. Examples of using a tax instrument to shift behaviors. So let's start with Sri Lanka, which was dealing with a major issue of air pollution, both indoor and outdoor. And so they were quite ahead of the curve. As early as 2008, the government used a series of tax exemption on the import of hybrid vehicles, followed by an increase in import taxes on petrol vehicle, and a decrease in import taxes on electric vehicles. And so with those tax incentives, it led to a significant increase in the registration of hybrid electric vehicles. You can see on the figure the growing number of hybrid and electric vehicles in the green bars. Another example I'd like to bring is on agricultural subsidies, this time in Vietnam. In 2015, the Vietnamese government acknowledged, one, the necessity to accelerate the transition towards greener farming practices, and two, the financial constraints of farmers. And so to answer to this, they established a credit support program. The credit was conditional on participation in training session on greener practices, and the farmers also gained access to higher quality planting material, gained access to credit for more efficient irrigation tools. And overall, the result of this was that by the end of 2017, more than 9,000 hectares of farmlands had received support from the program. And we also saw an increase in profit for the farmers who participated in the program. So this slide gives a very incomplete mapping of some of the fiscal initiatives in Asia. Full mapping would take a lot more time and a lot more slides. But this aims to give an idea of the variety of existing initiatives and reforms. So among the instruments I didn't mention, there's the establishment of blue bonds. The first ones in Asia, I think, were launched quite recently by the Bank of China. There was the use of fiscal incentive to lower the private cost of research and development, so that firms are more inclined to invest in innovation, as was the case in Malaysia and Singapore. I very briefly mentioned the creation of dedicated climate or green funds to finance priority actions for NDCs, like in India, and we also recently had the case of Bangladesh. So there's really a variety of instruments which ought to be adapted to the national context. And to finish, I'd like to briefly highlight a couple of things that are absolutely necessary and key for the success of any green fiscal policy reform. So the first thing to keep in mind is that environmental taxes can be progressive, they can have a redistributive effect, but for that they need to be designed the right way. Research shows very large potential with the gains of measures like carbon tax, that goes from reduced pollution and traffic congestion and reduced accident casualties and improved in health. But that's as long as they come with compensation packages for the most affected population, or it can also be temporarily for the most affected economic sectors. Because in the short run, the removal of for example, energy subsidies, agricultural subsidies, or the introduction of a new tax is likely to affect vulnerable groups. And that can be mitigated through safeguarding measures, for instance, through cash transfers or through an increase in support for social programs, etc. We saw a couple of examples of that. And these reforms should also include clear, targeted communication campaigns, really emphasize the importance of dialogue here. So that's through tripartite dialogue, stakeholder consultations. You just need to make sure that all actors are involved in the design of that policy, because that's the only way to make sure that equity is really at the center of the design. There should also be transparent monitoring and evaluation mechanisms set up, as this is likely to be an incremental process, and there will be a need to improve the instruments in the future based on lessons learned and on the results. So my last point here will be to emphasize the importance of including a communication strategy whenever developing a fiscal policy reform. Protests against energy and transport price hikes in many corners of the world highlight how sensitive populations can be to changing prices of basic commodities like fuel, because of course it impacts their livelihood. And while the gains from this kind of reform can be difficult to see, we're talking about long-term environmental gain, health gain. Meanwhile, the costs are actually very visible. So typically that's an increase in prices. And so when implementing the reform, the compensation measures, such as increase in social support, as well as the long-term gains that I was just mentioning, it can be, reduced soil pollution, improved access to clean water, etc. Those long-term gains need to be made very visible. So the photo you see here is in France, where I'm from, where people reacted very strongly when the government announced the introduction of the carbon tax. And I think that had a lot to do with errors in communication on the government side and a lack of emphasis of that social support that I was mentioning before. So yes, my last point would be remember to really work on a communication strategy when developing this reform. I will stop here and I will give the floor to Elisabeth. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Claire, for presenting so lucidly about this very, very important topic of subsidy reform. Very, very illuminating to see the different green fiscal instruments illuminated and where they've been applied, and very encouraging to hear that subsidies can be reformed with an eye to cost effectiveness, to health, to climate friendliness, but also to social equity. And I think the points you made in the end are very important. Thank you, and I think we'll follow up with some questions in the end in the question and answer sessions. Please keep posting them in the chat if you're interested. And now I would like to give the floor to another distinguished speaker who is joining us from Bangkok, from the IMF. Delphine Moretti is a regional advisor in the Southeast Asia office. She is based in the IMF Capacity Development Office in Bangkok, and she has been working in this role since January 2021. In her capacity, she leads several capacity development projects in the region, focusing on the budget frameworks and functions. Prior to this, she served at the IMF headquarters and the OECD, where she assisted advanced and emerging and developing countries in defining PFM systems, roadmaps, and introducing a range of budgetary reforms. She has led the OECD Senior Officials Network on financial management and reporting, and had a leadership role in research and analytical work on advanced practices, such as fiscal risks and balance sheet management and digitalization of financial reporting. Mrs. Moretti has also previously held positions at the Ministry of Finance and Supreme Audit Institution in France, and taught public financial management at the French School of Government. Delphine, the floor is yours.
So thank you, Elisabeth, and thank you to Claire for a very interesting presentation. So why is it important to talk about green PFM in a workshop that is dedicated to mobilizing domestic public finance for NDC priorities? I think Claire made very well the point of why it is important, but basically, I just want to say that although there are still many countries in the region that are battling the COVID-19 pandemic, the development and the delivery of recovery programs that will help meeting international commitments on climate change and the environment is very high on the agenda of most governments, who also have to deal with the fiscal legacy of the pandemic, which are elevated debt levels and reduced fiscal space. So in this decisive moment, there are many things that governments need to get right. As Claire mentioned, they need to get right their fiscal policies in light of their international commitments and national objectives, but they also need to get right the prioritization of these policies, their funding and their implementation. And this can be achieved only with sound public financial management, that is with sound fiscal institutions and processes to underlie the formulation of the new policies, the allocation of resources to these policies, and availability of funds for their actual implementation, as well, of course, as accountability over the results achieved. And concretely, what countries need now is not only good PFM, but green PFM. And green PFM implies the integration of an environment or climate-sensitive perspective into each step of the budget cycle and across the whole of government, with the objective to make budgetary decision-making systematically and equally responsive to environmental or climate and fiscal concerns. So two elements. Finally, and this is, I think, important in the context of today's discussion, green PFM is important also because it can provide credibility to governments that engage into green bond issuance or want to mobilize funding for their green policies. Investors in green bonds expect that they will fund expenditures and projects that are rigorously selected, seriously and timely implemented and accounted for with transparency, and green PFM practices, where they are well implemented, will provide the building block for this. Now, what is concretely green PFM? Green PFM is a notion that is akin to green budgeting, but has a wider scope. as it explicitly considers PFM functions that might go beyond the scope of the budget formulation and execution per se, such as coordination with local government and state-owned enterprises, as you can see on the slide. The tools that the countries can use for developing green PFM are plenty, as you can see on the slide. And basically, the best ones for a given country will depend on its existing PFM framework, on what are its strongest budget institutions, and the potential resources and capacity constraints that the country might be experiencing. I want to insist here on the fact that green PFM does not require a novel approach to public financial management, but is rather an adaptation of existing PFM processes and tools. And therefore, countries that have successfully experienced implementing performance budgeting, SDGs budgeting, or gender budgeting will obviously have a stronger starting point for implementing green PFM, although they will still need to develop methodologies and tools that are specific to climate and environment policies. In terms of where to start, because if you look at the list on the left, you might think there are a lot of things to do. Again, you don't have to do everything. And for me, the two obvious entry points are the planning and the budget formulation stages of the budget cycle. Specifically, the planning stage consists in defining a national development strategy and reconcile this strategy with overall resourcing constraints. This will often take the form of a medium-term fiscal framework that outlines the main macroeconomic assumptions and the macro fiscal baseline. And green priorities, both on the revenue and on the expenditure side, should be incorporated at this early stage, notably with respect to the content of the overall development plan or strategy, the identification of high-level mitigation and adaptation targets, the management of transition risks also, and the definition of the macroeconomic scenarios. Here, I would like to say that green PFM cannot be expected systematically to generate fiscal space for spending on new green initiatives, but it can be reasonably expected to help prioritizing and reallocating resources within a given country's existing fiscal space or constraints in a way that is consistent with its commitments on climate and the environment. And the budget preparation phase is similarly crucial for the inclusion of green priorities and concerns into a country's budgetary plans. All ministries, for the preparation of their budget submissions, may be instructed to estimate both the cost and climate impact of new policies using, for instance, a consistent set of assumptions on carbon dioxide prices. They can also be asked to put forward investment projects that are meeting new environmental and climate-related criteria. So these are just examples of how the PFM cycle, the budget procedures can be adapted to allow the Ministry of Finance and Cabinet to factor in systematically environmental concerns in budget decisions. But of course, there are all these items that are on the left of the slide where the green perspective can be introduced in the budget cycle. And in IMF publications, you have discussions of how to green each stage of the budget cycle. Now, let me move to public investment management, which is a subset of PFM. PIM is important because, as you know, climate change and natural disasters are already creating very significant needs for infrastructure investment, in particular in the Asia-Pacific region. And these needs have been estimated at around 9% of regional annual GDP over the next 15 years by the IMF. And this is the reason why the IMF considers that countries need to develop quickly the tools and capacities to integrate climate considerations into their public investment management frameworks. So what the IMF advised is that building on its pre-existing public investment management assessment tool, which was developed in 2015, to help countries in evaluating the strengths and weaknesses of their infrastructure governance. The IMF advised that countries use a new module that was developed recently to assess how climate change considerations are factored into public investment management. And the tool that has been developed by the IMF is developing recommendations where existing practices are below the desirable standards. Basically, there are 5 priority areas for the integration of climate consideration into public investment management. The first one is planning, and that means aligning national and sectoral plans and associated investment portfolios to climate objectives. The planning phase is also particularly relevant for incorporating climate into spatial planning and construction requirements. The second important area is coordination. Public investment can involve various layers of government, state-owned enterprises, public-private partnerships, for example, and integrating green considerations into public investment management thus means coordinating across all parts of the public sector and also in joint ventures with the private sector. The third priority area is appraisal and selection of projects. This is a crucial phase in the decision-making process on major infrastructure projects because it determines how projects get done. And it is essential that climate-related analysis of mitigation and adaptation impacts of investment are included in this phase. The fourth priority area is budget and portfolio management. I've already mentioned that when I was presenting very quickly green PFM, but green investment and maintenance allocation should be budgeted in the annual budget, and they should be also forecasted in other fiscal plans, such as the medium-term fiscal framework that I was just mentioning, or the medium-term expenditure framework. Finally, when it comes to public investment management, the other priority area, the last one, is fiscal risk management, because climate change involves risks that will have potential impacts on public infrastructure. And it is important that there are some natural disaster management strategies and that fiscal risk analysis incorporate these risks. And that risk mitigation strategies also take climate considerations into account. So,
sorry to interrupt.
Yes,
just to say 1 minute left. Thank you very much.
Oh yes, sorry, I don't see the time actually with this. So let me just say that maybe green PFM appears ambitious and complex, but it's not really a revolution. It is really about adapting existing practices to make them more climate sensitive. And it is our belief at the IMF that virtually all countries can integrate at least some aspects of a green PFM into their PFM framework. And you have here a few examples from the Asia Pacific region. I'm wrapping up this presentation by saying that the IMF is supporting the worldwide efforts on green PFM and green public investment management through its surveillance work, country-specific technical assistance, and also regional seminars and training. And if you want to read more about green PFM or the fiscal policies that the IMF advised to address climate change in Asia and the Pacific, you have the links on the last slide of the presentation, and I am also available, of course, to answer any follow-up questions. Thank you, Elisabeth, and sorry for not seeing the time pass on this display version.
Thank you very much. No need to be sorry. I could listen to this for a long time. Very, very encouraging to hear that the IMF and the IMF would know believes it's possible for all countries to integrate climate change into budgets. And thank you for providing those resources. And now I would like to welcome to the floor Asad Maken, who is a governance and public finance specialist at UNDP. a role in which he has gained substantial experience in different countries, public financial management systems, and significant experience in climate finance. He has had various leadership positions on this topic at UNDP and has worked previously for DFID, the Asian Development Bank, and the government of Pakistan. Asad, the floor is yours.
So, it's been a great learning listening to the earlier presentations. And the country examples that we heard from Vietnam and Bangladesh were super useful. So I'll just touch upon some of the work that has happened in Asia Pacific overall and the approaches that some of the countries taken in the region, and then identify a few challenges that we see country governments face in mainstreaming. Yeah, so the approach that it's not the UNDP approach, but that's what we have formulated in partnership with the governments. So we started the journey way back in 2012 in Nepal, where we started with climate public expenditure and institutional review. And that has been the case in many of the countries, because if you go back about 10 years, there wasn't a lot of work around climate budgeting. And the countries didn't have a lot of idea on the type of investments that they were making in climate change and the extent of the investments. So, and also, every country had its own institutional mechanisms, and a clear mapping of that institutional architecture was not there. So that was the starting point, to see that what are the investments that the government is making in climate change. And secondly, what is the governance and institutional framework in order to support the climate change action? Is it adequate? Is it inadequate? Does a mechanism exist or it doesn't exist? This was followed by the climate change financing framework, and because there were certain recommendations that were coming from CPIR. So some countries like Bangladesh, for instance, Nepal, Pakistan, they came up with a climate change financing framework around the years 2017-18, and that basically outlined the roadmap for mainstreaming climate change into the public financial management system. And simultaneously, some countries started moving towards taking some of the actions. For instance, putting in place the climate budget tagging system, and that was because the CPIR was an expensive exercise and a very lengthy one as well, and also didn't provide updated information. That was one. And again, some of the countries like Indonesia, for instance, put in place the climate budget tagging system. We heard the presentation from Bangladesh, and one of the reasons that there was such clear information was the climate budget tagging system that the government of Bangladesh put in place there. And then taking that holistic approach and bringing in the other actors, the civil society, the parliamentarians, and finally moving on to integration of climate change into the medium-term budget framework or the annual budget, whatever the pattern countries are following. And finally, influencing the effectiveness and mobilization of resources. So in Indonesia, for instance, the budget tagging system was used to identify the green projects under the green scope. Similarly, you heard earlier from Bangladesh about the inclusion of climate change in the MTAF. So that's the sort of things that we ultimately have been aiming at, and in some countries that's something which has been realized. But what how do countries approach? It could be a top-down approach. It could be a bottom-up approach, and we've seen that different countries have contextualized it differently. And some countries have taken this approach simultaneously. So, and I'll give you the example of Cambodia, where the Ministry of Finance, Economy and Finance started to include climate change in the budget called circular, and accordingly what systemic changes need to be put in place. But at the same time also started working on the climate change cost benefit analysis, so that information also becomes available. But some countries, for instance, Nepal, started with the top-down approach, where they worked on with changing the systems first, and then brought it to the sector ministry level. In Fiji, we have seen it the opposite, where there have been bottom-up initiatives where this has been integrated into different projects, and that's something then which has led to that dialogue with the Ministry of Economy and Finance to bring in the changes, put in place a regulatory environment, develop that enabling environment, which actually then supports the implementation of those bottom-up initiatives. Some of the instruments were earlier mentioned by IMF, but I mean, and some of the other colleagues who made presentations. But the climate change cost benefit analysis is something that some countries are considering. Thailand is one which is pilot testing. Similarly, as I mentioned, it is also being done in Cambodia. CPIR and CBT have been used by the governments to understand how much government spends on climate change. Then, I mean, about the budget statements, I mean, how does the information on climate change expenditures get reflected in the budget statements? And also, the budget policy statement, does it include climate change as one of the priority areas, because that does make a difference. And some of the supporting tools could be climate expenditure reports, annexes on climate change allocations that the government can do. Similarly, leveraging more budget resources for climate change. There's been a lot of discussion around green sukuks, debt swaps, also carbon pricing, and use research to basically come up with the evidence for advocacy on one investment in climate change, and also, I mean, informing these sectors about the issues that exist in that respective sector, and I mean, possibly also identify the financing gap for those sectors. So that's something that can, I mean, it's a continuous thing, but very, very important for some of the sectors. And finally, increased accountability for budget spending in climate change. So some of the countries like Pakistan and Nepal have developed parliamentary guidebook in order to undertake the climate change, in order to undertake the scrutiny of the budget with a climate change lens. Cambodia and Nepal have developed climate citizen budget. So I just wanted to bring to your notice some of these tools that are being that have been adopted and implemented by the countries. And this is the overall snapshot of where countries have moved on in terms of the fiscal framework, the budget preparation, the budget execution. So you would see a varied level of progress that countries have made. Just to mention, I mean, the approaches again for integrating not only climate change but also looking at the gender and social inclusion angle. Just mention Fiji, for instance, where risk screening for development projects have been integrated in the monitoring evaluation system in the Ministry of Rural and Maritime Development. And as I mentioned earlier, I mean, that's something that has led to the Ministry of Economy and Finance now putting in place the climate budget tagging system, and also making some changes in the systems and reforms, so that this intervention that has been done at the Ministry of Rural and Maritime Development can be replicated in other ministries. Similarly, I mean, Bangladesh is a leading example, and we have heard quite extensively on that. But adding to the earlier presentation, Bangladesh has also been working on adaptive social protection guidelines, so that social protection angle is also there. And it's one government which has done it at the national and sub-national level. I already mentioned the accountability part, so I won't get into the detail of that. This is the trajectory of reforms that Indonesia has gone about. And I'm sure this presentation will be shared, and you can see that how it has moved on, starting with the climate budget tagging to now, I mean, launching a public climate finance report in 2021, which captures 3 years information. Similarly, in Pakistan, I mean, it started again with the CPIR. The climate change financing framework was developed. Climate change got included in the economic survey, budget in brief, and then finally, pilot climate change was included in the medium-term budgetary framework for 2 sector ministries at the federal level and 2 at the sub-national level. This is a brief, what you call the cobweb for the movement that countries have made on climate change budget integration, and this is the tool that has been developed by UNDP in consultation with a few governments. Some of the challenges, I mean, limited institutional arrangement is a challenge, and another key challenge is that the capacity of the sector ministries, because it's a huge task that that the sectors have to undertake, and that's something probably which was mentioned by Vietnam probably, or about the importance of the sector ministries taking it forward. So it is a limitation. And then about the access to information. So that's also something when the governments want to have more information on private and international climate finance, that's not available. Finally, how do we make the entire process more robust? And that's where, I mean, the analysis becomes really, really very important. It's fine to have the CPIR, it's fine to have the climate budget tagging system. But how do you link it with the NDCs? How do you undertake an analysis that can inform the budget formulation process? So that's something that the countries across Asia Pacific probably need to consider. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you very much, Asad. I'll come back to this with some questions in the Q&A, because some questions have been posed. And for our final presentation before the Q&A, I welcome Elva Bova. She is the Deputy Head of the National Fiscal Frameworks and Institutions Unit at the European Commission's Directorate General for Economic and Financial Affairs. She joined the DG ECFIN in 2016, working the fiscal desk for Portugal and on horizontal files. From 2010 to 2016, she was an economist at the IMF in the Fiscal Affairs Department, contributing to the Fiscal Monitor and as a country desk for commodity-producing economies in the African Department. She also worked as a senior economist for the Foundation for European Progressive Studies. Elva, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Elisabeth. I hope you can all hear me clearly. So thanks also for the opportunity to be here, to learn from you, and to have an exchange of knowledge or practices around Asia and the EU. Today, I will tell you a little bit more what's going on in the EU and the EU member states. I will provide you with key definitions and concepts, some evidence on the approaches used, zooming in on the approach used by France, Italy, and then also looking at different approaches when it comes to governance and accountability. And I will provide you with some references on work that we've been doing. When we talk about green budgeting, we refer to using the tools of budgetary policymaking to help achieve environmental goals. And this includes evaluating environmental impact of budgetary or fiscal policies and assessing their coherence towards the delivery of national and international commitments. We use here the definition developed by the OECD in 2018 which provides a broad understanding of green budgeting. Why do we care about green budgeting? We believe that budgets, and I think everybody in this virtual room agree, are one of the main expressions of how a government wants to implement its political ambition. And so aligning budgets with environmental objectives is crucial for the ecological transition. When we talk about the question of how to address, how to answer, how green is your budget, we see that countries, particularly in the EU, either explicitly identify green items in the budget, or they do assess the contribution to green objectives of the entire budget through what you would be already familiar with, budgetary tagging. Let's look a bit at the evidence of approaches. We conducted in 2021 a survey on green budgeting practices across the EU member states. Almost all of them replied. And we learned that most member states have green budgeting practices in place or have plans for green budgeting practices. 10 member states have no plans and they conduct no green budgeting. Now, let me specify that in this chart, when we talk about green budgeting, we really mean identifying what is green in your budget. So we're talking about green budget tagging or the production and presentation in your budget of impact assessment analysis. And below you will find the link to the survey and the survey results. Let's look at what we think is the most advanced country in terms of producing green budgeting reports, France. France created in 2017 the Paris Collaborative on Green Budgeting, together with OECD and Mexico, and has done a lot since then to promote the use of green budgeting. The draft budgets since 2020 have an annex on green budgeting, where they really conduct in-depth analysis to try to identify environmental impacts. And let me guide you a little bit into their methodology. So if you see from the chart, and this is for the state budget 2022, so this current year, the French authorities distinguish between items, and these are mostly, these are expenditure, fiscal expenditure and tax expenditure that are favorable to the environment, that are unfavorable, and also they distinguish those expenditures that have a mixed impact. Now, this amounts to about 53.4 billion, corresponding to 9% of the total expenditure, meaning 9% are environmentally relevant, including also brown, and the rest would be neutral. For example, wages and salaries, social transfers, or will not be yet assessed, since the methodology is evolving over time. And this is, for example, all the transfers that France would give to the EU budget. They've not been assessed whether they are green or brown or mixed. Now, you might be wondering, what do we mean by mixed? How can something be green and brown? So the French approach is quite comprehensive, as it covers 6 environmental objectives. Maybe you are familiar with the EU taxonomy of environmental activities. These are the 6 objectives that are considered in the taxonomy. Basically, climate change mitigation, climate change adaptation, water resource management, circular economy and waste, pollution abatement, biodiversity, and sustainable land use. The idea being, and I think we all agree, that the environmental objective is quite a complex one. Sometimes some policies might have a positive impact on one of them, like climate change mitigation, but maybe at the same time, they might have a negative impact on another environmental objective. So it is crucial to understand this complexity of the impacts and also quite of conflicting direction of impacts. The way France examines its budget in their budgetary tagging methodology is really to go through each mission and each program of the budget, and pardon the French here, because this is a snapshot of their budgetary annex, and try to tag them and distinguish between what is neutral, favorable, or unfavorable. You will see the colors. Green would be clearly a favorable item. For example, studies on sustainable development would be always green for all the objectives that we mentioned before: climate adaptation, mitigation, water, waste, pollution, biodiversity. Then it comes to something like railways, and railways would have a clearly mixed impact. They could be favorable for climate mitigation, but they're clearly unfavorable when it comes to waste and when it comes to biodiversity. In case the environmental impact cannot be assessed, then there would be a neutral tag, what you see here in gray. And then eventually they would assess the average sort of the impacts and indicate whether this is favorable, unfavorable, or mixed. Italy is also quite a country which has a developed practice in terms of green budgeting. And here you would see that they've been presenting every year since the year 2000 an eco-budget report as an annex to the draft budget package, where they indicate how much their budget is green with respect to specific environmental objectives. They also present an eco-execution report for the execution of their budget since 2010. And then for the medium-term budget report, they attach an annex on climate policies, where they try to look at how the medium-term policies could match climate objectives. You might be interested to know that they also have a well-being annex, which includes also environmental consideration attached to the medium-term budget. And then they publish every year since 2015 a catalog of environmentally favorable and unfavorable subsidies, including tax expenditure. So Italy presents its environmental expenditure in the eco-budget by activities, by ministry, and by some government finance statistics categories. So here, for example, you see the difference between current spending and capital spending. Let me draw your attention to the amounts here. We're talking about amounts of billion euros of 6 for quite a change with respect to the amounts of 40 or 30 in France. And this is due to the fact that they use a different definition of what is green. So Italy would really capture what is unequivocally green and insert in their green expenditure, whereas France would try to look also at indirect effects, something that could be green to a, let's say, to a lower shade of green, would include also in their budget. How do they proceed? So Italy considers the environmental objectives that are in the UN classifications on environmental protection and resource management activities that you see listed here. For example, wastewater management, waste management, or if you go into the CRIMA classification on resource management, you can see management of waters, management of energy resources, and then they assign their expenditure to each of these objectives, as you see here. For example, a majority of 30% of their environmental expenditure is allocated to soil and water protection. Then 11% is allocated to air and climate protection. How do they do that? The approach is quite similar to the one implemented by France, meaning they screen all subchapters of the budget to identify whether there is an expenditure item that has no environmental contribution, has a clear environmental contribution, or it has a contribution which has, it's an item which has a mixed contribution with no environmental impact or with an environmental impact. And then they check those environmentally related contributions to see if they can be attached or assigned to each of the objectives, the SIPA and CRIMA objectives that we showed to you before. So for example, in the table that you see here, let's look at the subchapter of monitoring and abatement of sea pollution from the Ministry of Environment. This would match two objectives of the classification of environment protection activities. Number 2 would be wastewater management, and then biodiversity protection. And then they go all the way to say not only which objectives are aimed, but also to what extent. And so this sub-chapter would aim at these two objectives by 50%, each of them. No? So you could see on the right-hand side of the chart. Let me tell you a little bit more about the governance and accountability. And this is something that relates to several countries in the EU. The governments, when we screen the experiences, we see that green budgeting, in the sense of green budgetary tagging or impact assessment analysis, is done in a different way, country by country, and there is a large diversity of approaches. For example, in Luxembourg, the Inspectorate of Finance distributes the budget circular to the different line ministries, and then it's the Inspectorate of Finance that guides the line ministries in the process, in the tagging process, and it prepares the report. In France, we have a more centralized approach. The General Inspectorate of Finances plus a sort of a task force, they develop the budgeting report together with discussions with the line ministries. In Sweden, the budget bill has a report on green taxes and expenditures, which is an interministerial work using documents from several agencies. In Ireland, the Department of Public Expenditure Reform, basically the Ministry of Finance, does directly the tracking, but after a lot of discussion with the line ministries. In Finland, the Ministry of Finance and line ministries produce the initial tagging exercise, and then it's the Ministry of Finance that provides annual updates and then double check what the line ministries have done. Finally, Italy is the Ministry of Finance that implements the tagging, but then the line ministries have the possibility to review it, and the Ministry of Finance prepares the report. When we talk about other elements that are important for green budgeting, we clearly care about accountability. And we try to see if there are sort of independent evaluations that are done. So if there are independent bodies that are involved in the green budgeting process. And we find that, for example, in France, the methodology that I just presented to you has been heavily discussed with several think tanks and the civil society. These independent evaluations also look at specific environmental policies in Sweden and in the Netherlands. And in Ireland, they go all the way to provide advice to the government. So there are independent institutions that provide advice to the government with what we call a comply or explain principle, where the government is required to either comply with the advice or to explain why it does not comply. In some countries, we see that there are independent evaluations of budgeting reports, also to make sure that there is no greenwashing. And this is the case of the Italian Court of Auditors or the European Court of Auditors for the EU budget. And then we also wanted to check what was the role of the Parliament if all these green budgeting reports are really taken seriously at parliamentary level and in parliamentary discussions. For example, in Italy, there is an obligation to send reports to Parliament. In Ireland, the green budgeting related programs are discussed and voted in Parliament. And in France, green budgeting reports are also discussed in Parliament within the budgetary discussions. Let me show you a slide that might resonate to you. So we see the development, quite fast development in Europe, and here I also insert the UK, of what we call independent bodies to advise government on climate policies, exactly what we were mentioning before. They take a variety of tasks and they play the role of climate or environmental watchdog. In a sense, they can provide more transparency to the process, but also independent evaluation. So they have indeed an expertise in terms of climate and environment, and they put this expertise at the service of the governments. I have here some references that you can consult on what is being done at the EU level. The last link takes you to our main webpage where it indicates what we've been doing. in the Commission for the EU member states, and also what type of support. Since I see that I have 3 minutes left, though, I would like to come quickly to something that we've been developing for the member states to guide them in how to implement green budgeting practices. So the Commission has developed a green budgeting reference framework to support the member states in embarking in green budgeting. And it's also a way for us to be able to monitor these practices. It builds on public financial management tools, also on evidence that we've seen across the EU member states. It does not propose a one-size-fits-all model, so it's a framework that could apply to different countries. You know, every EU country has a different way of presenting its own budget and a different budgetary process. But then it tries to promote a consistency of practices guided by what we consider to be the best practice, and it's meant to be flexible over time. The framework has 5 main elements. So we provide recommendations regarding the coverage, what type of environmental objectives should be covered, and we try to push for the entirety of the environmental objectives. We also try to have a whole of government approach, so the entirety of the general government. And then when it comes to coverage, we also look at what budgetary items are we talking about. Another element of the framework is the methodology. So how to do green budget tagging, how to do impact assessment analysis. We also provide recommendations with respect to the deliverables, what should be presented, how it should be presented, where in the budget, where in the medium-term budget plans. And we go also all over to discuss governance and transparency accountability. So for the governments, our main idea is that it should be centralized at the level of the Ministry of Finance, but then with close collaboration with line ministries. And for transparency and accountability, we clearly want the process to be as open as possible with the inclusion of what we mentioned before, the climate and environmental watchdogs that could protect, say, the process from possible greenwashing. The framework, you will see, has a phased approach. A country can be at an essential level of this framework, developed level, or advanced level, according to their preferences and also their capacities, because we understand that green budgeting can be quite a resource-intensive process. And with this, I conclude my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Elva, and thank you very much for staying on time. We're a little bit delayed because of some delay early on, but thank you for giving us this deep dive on countries in the EU. I would like now to ask the panelists to turn their cameras on for a brief Q&A session so we can answer some of the questions that we've received and that have arisen. If you could turn on your cameras so that we can see you. My first question would go, please feel free to turn them on. Elva, the first question is to you, and it's a direct follow-up on what you presented in your presentation. You showed us clearly how France does it, how Italy does it, and I'm wondering, when they assess these budget items, these budget lines, do the EU countries that you analyzed apply some sort of weighing or scoring criteria like the Rio markers that for instance, are used in development aid a lot?
So, you may know that the Rio marker is used quite heavily for the EU budget, which is the budget that the European Commission spends for the member states. And for that, we track every item, considering the percentages of the Rio markers, meaning 100%, 40%, and 0% if there is no climate contribution. Member states do not really use a Rio marker, so the French approach has the different shades of green. What it means is that they consider not really 100 or 40, but they consider what is greener, less green, so they put 1, 2, and 3. Bit similar, but not really the same gradation. Ireland, they just consider 0 and 100. And Italy, if you see, they could put percentages, but they're not really like the Rio marker. So there is not an adoption of that methodology, which is used internally quite heavily.
Thank you very much. Another question that we've had is to Delphine. In your presentation, you mentioned green public financial management and a possible link to the credibility of green bonds. And that struck me because I heard our speaker from Vietnam also relating to green bonds. Can you speak a little bit on where you see this going, or how you see this link between the credibility of green bonds and green public financial management?
Look, at the moment, I think there is no clear link, because there is no requirement in the legislation very often to have implemented green PFM for accessing climate finance. Also, there is no clear requirement that green PFM be implemented. But I think implementing green PFM is really part of the building blocks for the credibility of governments that seek to mobilize resources for implementing climate sensitive policies. I do hope that the international standards and the national legislation will make that link more obvious in the future. It's obvious for me, as I said during the presentation, that investors, often donors that provide funding for implementing these policies, will want the level of transparency and accountability that a green PFM framework or a PIM framework, because public investment management is a very important part of PFM, would provide. I think this was coming out very clearly also from the presentation of Eva, the level of transparency and accountability that can be achieved if a good green PFM framework is implemented.
Thank you very much. And then a final question to Claire. One question that we received, you relayed a lot on green fiscal policies. What if a country, and also the importance of reducing harmful subsidies, what resources or what tools or what advice would you give to countries that want to set out and go through their subsidy scheme and suss out what it could be a climate harmful subsidies?
Thank you for the question. I would say there are a few steps that you can't miss if you want to look at the reform of harmful subsidies, whether these are fishery subsidies, agricultural subsidies, fossil subsidies. First, the first step would be to assess the support that's already provided. So do kind of mapping of the types, the volume, the target of those subsidies, who receive them, with what impact it has on our social and environmental and health objectives. And once you've done that, identify the impact that those have. After you've done this kind of like a mapping assessment of the current situation, the next step would be, as you move forward, as you start designing an approach for the repurposing, for example, of the subsidies, or for the suppression of the subsidies, based on the previous findings, you identify actions and targets, and that's when dialogue becomes really key. So as you design your new reform project, you want to estimate the impact that this repurposing of subsidies would have, or that your new tax would have on whether that's on nature, on jobs, on the economy, what would be the social impact of this reform. And that's when you share it with the relevant actors who can help you identify, for example, potential trade-off that you might not have accounted for. And so based on all this, you can then review your strategy. And the last step would be, as you start implementing your strategy, and that's something that I touched upon a little bit in the presentation, is you really want to monitor constantly the outcomes of this new type of support, of either the repurposing of your subsidy or of your new tax instrument. You want to monitor constantly because, again, it will be an incremental process, so you want to know about the impact on farmers, the impact on consumers and producers, the potential institutional gaps that might arise and need to be adjusted. So yeah, monitoring really is key to be able to adjust as needed. That would be an overview in terms of advice for the implementation of such a policy.
Thank you very much. Thank you for relaying that. We're over time, so there's not too much, time for me to share my closing thoughts. But I really think that these presentations speak for themselves and the answers to the question. We learned that Green PFM, while in its early stages, is progressing. No country has a comprehensive Green PFM system that's perfect yet, but the work is developing, and many countries are picking up components of it to great effect. What I think this webinar is evidence of, and all this work is evidence of, is that there's a community of practice emerging. We also learn on the challenges from countries in Asia. We learned how to overcome them, and I hope this webinar has provided some resources how to do that. So with these words, I would like to thank our panelists and our participants, our attendants, for their participation. Note that there will be a recording of this event available on our website, linked to YouTube, and we will share the recording or link to the recording. There will be another webinar of this kind related to urban cooling later in the spring, so look out for an invitation from us. And yes, with these words I close and thank you all, and have a good evening or a good afternoon.